Tonight, we are going to do something that sounds far more energetic than it really is. We are going to solve a few sleepy mysteries with Sherlock Holmes, which mostly means we will stand in drawing rooms, stare at bits of mud, notice that people are wearing the wrong cuffs for the wrong kind of weather, and quietly ruin everyone's attempt to keep a secret. So settle in, lower the lights, get comfortable, and if this sort of slow Victorian detection helps you drift off, do remember to quietly subscribe. There is no need to do it dramatically. Sherlock Holmes would almost certainly disapprove of dramatic gestures unless they were useful. Then again, he did occasionally arrange an entrance like a man who knew perfectly well he was in the best room. Up to understand why Holmes became the great patron saint of noticing things other people missed, it helps to begin not with a murder, not with a scream in the fog, and not even with a violin in the night, but with a city that was always inventing new ways to be confusing. Victorian London was loud, crowded, busy, smoky, damp, overconfident, and absolutely full of people who believed they could get away with things simply because everyone else was too tired to pay attention. This was an understandable theory. London, in the late 19th century, could exhaust you before breakfast. The city streets were jammed with cabs, omnibuses, carts, horses, clerks, errand boys, flower sellers, newsboys, cooks, carrying baskets, women hurrying through markets, gentlemen pretending not to hurry through markets, and the occasional determined goose. The air tasted of coal smoke, whetstone, tobacco, horse, river, and whatever unfortunate experiment a nearby factory had decided to make public. In such a place, a person could vanish into the crowd, but so could a clue, a motive, a stain, a lie, or an unpaid bill. Holmes belonged to this world perfectly because he understood something very simple. Chaos is only chaos to the people who have not yet sorted it. To everyone else, it is just a messy filing cabinet. His creator, Arthur Conan Doyle, borrowed part of that habit from Dr. Joseph Bell, the Edinburgh surgeon famous for astonishing students by deducing a stranger's work, habits, and origin from posture, hands, clothing, and accent. Doyle took that principle, added London gaslight, a violin, cocaine in the years before that seemed like a terrible idea even to the people using it, and gave the world a consulting detective who did not merely solve crimes, but professionally noticed the obvious in a way so concentrated it ceased being obvious at all. And so, on a damp evening in Baker Street, where the fire burns low and the fog presses faintly against the glass, let us imagine that we arrive not as police inspectors, not as criminals, and certainly not as landlords, because that would spoil the mood, but as quiet observers seated in the familiar sitting room at 221B. The room is comfortable in the untidy manner of a place constantly used by men who consider tidiness an interesting theory. Books lean against other books. Newspapers lie in drifts. Chemical equipment occupies a side table with the insolent confidence of objects that know they are more important than furniture. A Persian slipper may or may not contain tobacco. The violin rests within reach. Holmes himself is stretched thinly in an armchair, eyes half closed, fingertips pressed together, looking either deeply asleep or catastrophically awake. With Holmes, these two states often resembled each other. Watson sits nearby, solid, decent, faintly baffled already, which is his natural condition in these matters, and one of the reasons people love him. He is the ideal companion for the rest of us, intelligent, brave, loyal, practical, and constantly forced to admit that he has somehow missed the fact that a client recently changed barbers. quarreled with a cousin, spent 3 months in Ceylon, and has a terrier named Augustus. Mrs. Hudson has brought in tea. Holmes has ignored it. Watson has not. Civilization depends on such divisions of labor. The first mystery of the evening arrives quietly, which is how the best sleepy mysteries prefer to arrive. There is a knock, measured but anxious, and into the room comes a gentleman of about 40, carefully dressed but not naturally elegant, the kind of man who has purchased respectability in installments. His coat is good cloth, but brushed too often at the sleeves. His hat is expensive, but held with the uneasy tenderness of a recent owner. His side whiskers suggest effort. His expression suggests suffering. He introduces himself as Mr. Edwin Pomeroy, a partner in a modest but respectable firm dealing in imported stationery and account books near Holborn. This is exactly the sort of trade that makes Victorian society function and sends no one into poetry. Mr. Pomeroy explains, after some hesitation, that a packet has disappeared from his office. It contains not money, not jewels, not government secrets, and not blackmail letters of a quality fit for a serialized magazine, but something more dreadful to a businessman, a list of names and balances related to a private arrangement with several clients. If published or even shown to the wrong competitors, it would be embarrassing, damaging, and expensive. Holmes asks when the packet vanished. Mr. Pomeroy says it was last seen yesterday afternoon in the locked drawer of his office desk and discovered missing this morning. Holmes asks who knew of it. Pomeroy says only himself, his junior partner, Mr. Lascelles, and possibly his clerk, though the clerk was not told directly. Holmes asks whether the drawer was forced. No. Whether there are duplicate keys. Yes, one. Usually kept in a small iron box at home. Usually is a useful word. Holmes asks whether the packet might have been misplaced. Mr. Pomeroy replies with the haggard dignity of a man who has searched 3 times already, and would search a 4th, if made to feel foolish enough. Holmes asks him where he sat on entering, then does not let him sit at all. Instead, he steps close, glances once at the man's cuffs, once at his boots, once at the silk hat in his hand, and asks whether Mrs. Pomeroy has lately taken charge of the household accounts. Mr. Pomeroy blinks, yes. Holmes then asks whether Mr. Pomeroy left home in haste this morning after a domestic disagreement. More blinking. Also, yes, Watson is already alert in the familiar way of a man who can feel a lecture forming around him. Holmes asks whether the duplicate key from the iron box has been moved. Mr. Pomeroy admits he has not checked. Holmes says he should. The gentleman looks shaken by the suggestion that the mystery may have occurred not among plotting commercial rivals, but in his own perfectly ordinary residence, where the carpets are no doubt sincere and the gravy boats respectable. Holmes asks one more question. Did Mrs. Pomeroy recently discover a bill, note, or account that displeased her? At this, the client reddens in the exact tone of a man whose harmless discretion has proved less discreet than hoped. There is, he says, a milliner's account. A large one. Holmes nods with the grave patience of a clergyman hearing that sin has once again involved receipts. He tells Mr. Pomeroy to go home, examine the iron box, speak honestly to his wife, and if the packet is still missing by morning, return. The man leaves in profound confusion. Watson, who has spent the interview behaving heroically in the face of incomplete information, asks Holmes How he knew. Holmes explains in the tone of a man rearranging spoons. The cuffs showed faint graphite smudges from household account pages rather than office ledgers. The right glove had been buttoned hastily and one fastening strained, suggesting agitation before departure. The hat, though new, had a crease at the side from being gripped rather than worn calmly. The boots carried dried grit not from Holborn but from a short garden path laid in reddish gravel, and most tellingly, the gentleman smelled very faintly of violet powder, not on his person generally, but only at one sleeve, as if a wife had passed close while retrieving or replacing something at home. So the great mystery, Watson says, is probably matrimonial. The majority of human mysteries are, Holmes replies. The police merely receive the more theatrical residue. This, even by Holmesian standards, is magnificently dry. And, as often happened, Holmes is correct. The next morning, Mr. Pomeroy returns transformed by equal parts relief and humiliation. His wife had indeed taken the duplicate key, opened the desk in his absence some days earlier, after suspecting financial secrecy, removed the packet, read enough to realize it involved clients and not romance, then replaced it in the wrong portfolio in the iron box. She had said nothing, because she was waiting to see whether her husband would confess either to hidden debts or to the milliner's bill. He had confessed to neither, because he had hoped both might somehow tire and go away. They had not. Holmes accepts thanks without pleasure. The case was not interesting, which in Holmes's vocabulary means it did not involve footprints on a ceiling or a vicar with poison in the hymn books. For us, however, it is a perfect beginning, because it reveals something central about Sherlock Holmes. He is not primarily a hunter of villains leaping from the shadows. He is a patient interpreter of human untidiness. He knows that people hide papers badly, lie inconsistently, panic decoratively, and carry the evidence of their private foolishness on sleeves, shoes, handwriting, pocket contents, and the shape of their excuses. The next mystery arrives 2 days later, and this one is smaller still, although Holmes takes an immediate interest precisely because it appears beneath notice. A housemaid from a respectable Bloomsbury boarding house has come in distress. Her name is Alice Marden, and she has traveled with a determination that suggests she nearly turned back twice and was too annoyed with life to do so a third time. One of the lodgers, a retired schoolmaster named Mr. Hollis, claims that someone enters his room during the afternoon and moves tiny objects. A bookmark no longer lies in his Greek grammar. His spectacles are shifted 3 inches to the left. A biscuit disappears from a saucer. A framed miniature of his mother is turned at a slightly different angle. The landlady thinks him peculiar. The maid thinks him observant. The other lodgers think both. Holmes asks whether anything valuable has gone missing. No. Whether doors are locked, usually. Whether windows open to the street, only narrowly. Whether anyone has enemies. Mr. Hollis once taught boys for 30 years, so statistically, yes, though none are known to be active. Watson suspects at once that age and solitude have sharpened the old man's habits into obsession. Holmes does not disagree, but he also does not dismiss the complaint, which is one reason clients continue to come to him. A thing may be small and still real. That afternoon, he and Watson visit the boarding house. We follow them through streets damp from recent rain, past bookshops, stationers, and the endless serious windows of London respectability. Inside the house, the hallway smells of boiled cabbage, polish, and coal, which is to say the empire. Mr. Hollis is thin, nearsighted, exact, and offended by approximations of any kind. He shows Holmes the room. It is neat in the severe fashion of a man who believes objects should know their place morally as well as physically. There is the Greek grammar, the spectacles, the biscuit dish, the miniature, the washstand, the narrow bed, the chair whose angle to the hearth seems to matter spiritually, and the window looking over a rear area where laundry lines hang, with the weary resignation of laundry everywhere. Holmes takes very little interest in the old schoolmaster's complaints at first. Instead, he studies the window catch, the coal scuttle, the rug, the hearth, the jug of water, the door latch, and, curiously, the biscuit tin. Then he asks for an afternoon alone in the room. The landlady, offended but curious, consents. Holmes positions the objects exactly as Mr. Hollis describes, closes the door, and stations himself not within the room, but in the adjoining empty chamber, where a communicating vent high in the wall allows sound to pass. Watson and Holmes wait. Waiting was, in truth, much of detective work then and now, although fiction often prefers sprinting. After 20 minutes, there is a small scrape. Another, a faint tap near the fireplace. Holmes rises instantly, enters the room, and reaches not for a criminal mastermind, but for the coal scuttle. From beneath it emerges a creature of modest villainy, a large gray rat carrying the missing biscuit in a style suggesting no remorse whatsoever. Watson laughs. Mr. Hollis does not. But Holmes is not finished. The rat, he explains, has been nudging at objects while traveling the room along habitual paths from a crack near the hearth to the saucer on the washstand. The spectacles were shifted by its flank. The miniature was brushed when the animal used the ledge by the wall as temporary cover. The bookmark moved because the grammar had been nosed open where crumbs had once fallen between pages. The old man is vindicated and also, unfortunately, living above a rat rout of some sophistication. The landlady promises traps. Mr. Hollis, vastly relieved to be neither mad nor sloppy, pays Holmes with a gratitude entirely disproportional to the market value of one stolen biscuit. Yet Holmes seems pleased. Later, in the cab, Watson notes that the mystery was hardly grand. Holmes replies that grandeur is usually just small facts standing very close together in expensive clothes. A rat, a crumb, and an attentive witness are as respectable a beginning as any jewel theft. He then adds that old men in boarding houses are often ignored until they become either dead or impossible, and it is humane to prevent both outcomes. That, more than the cleverness, is the sort of line that quietly redeems Holmes from his own reputation. Because, for all the violin, the sharpness, the theatrical deductions, and the occasional habit of treating Scotland Yard like a collection of eager houseplants, Holmes is at his best when he extends his full intelligence to people whom society has filed under unimportant. He will pursue a duchess's scandal if it is interesting, certainly. But he will also spend an afternoon proving to a tired maid that her lodger is not inventing invisible burglars out of loneliness. This, in sleepy fashion, is heroic. Not loud heroism, no one waves hats, but useful heroism, which matters more. London outside continues in its great gray churn. Night falls early. Lamps bloom in the streets. Newspaper boys shout headlines about Parliament, shipping, and crimes much less soothing than ours. Cabs clatter. Shop fronts glow amber in the fog. Somewhere a public house erupts in optimism, and then settles back into beer. Back in Baker Street, the fire is rebuilt. Holmes takes up the violin and draws from it not a dazzling concert performance, but something wandering, private, and almost absent-minded. The sort of music a person produces when thinking of 5 things at once and feeling only 2 of them. Watson writes, "This, too, is an important part of the Sherlock Holmes universe." The world did not merely receive Holmes, it received Watson's version of Holmes, shaped by admiration, exasperation, loyalty, and the very human desire to make one's difficult friend look as remarkable as he insists on being. Without Watson, Holmes might simply have remained a brilliant, difficult Londoner with ash on the carpet. With Watson, he becomes immortal. That immortality, naturally, rests on a very practical foundation. Someone had to write things down. The third mystery of our evening comes in by post. Holmes opens the envelope with unusual attention, because the handwriting, he observes, belongs to someone pretending to have less education than they possess. This sort of thing brightens his day immensely. The letter is from a lady living in Kensington, Mrs. Lenora Vale, widow of a civil engineer, who requests private assistance concerning a matter that is trifling in substance, yet distressing in repetition. Holmes likes those words. Trifling in substance suggests the police will not care. Distressing in repetition suggests a pattern. A pattern is merely a confession waiting to remove its coat. The next morning, Holmes and Watson visit the widow's house, a comfortable place with polished brass, heavy curtains, and the faint atmosphere of a home, determined not to be embarrassed by grief. Mrs. Vale receives them in a morning room lined with books, chosen by a husband and maintained by a wife too sensible to discard them. She is calm, well-spoken, and not at all the fluttering victim lesser storytellers might provide. Her complaint is odd. For the past 6 weeks, every Thursday, exactly one small household object vanishes from the breakfast table before the tray is cleared, never anything valuable. A salt spoon one week, a napkin ring another, an egg cup, a small preserved knife, a silver teaspoon, and most recently, a folded breakfast card on which the butcher's account had been noted. No servants admit involvement. No outsider is seen. The breakfast room windows open onto a narrow side garden enclosed by brick. The door remains in sight. Her nephew, who lives with her while studying engineering, thinks a servant is pilfering. The cook suspects the housemaid. The housemaid suspects the footman. The footman considers suspicion beneath him, which is exactly the sort of attitude that invites it. Holmes asks who breakfasts at table on Thursdays. Mrs. Vale herself, her nephew Henry, and until recently, her sister when in town. Holmes asks why only Thursdays. Mrs. Vale answers that Thursdays are the days the greengrocer, butcher, and dairyman accounts are checked against the household book. Holmes asks to see the breakfast room. There we have a neat table by a window, a sideboard, a tray stand, a carpet, and a canary in a cage hanging near the light. Holmes notices the canary at once. He notices everything at once, but some things he notices a little more. He asks whether the bird is new. Mrs. Vale says it was given by the nephew 3 months earlier. Holmes nods and spends an annoyingly long time looking at the window sill, then the carpet under the table, then the nephew's cuffs, then the bird cage, then the nephew again. Henry Vale is about 23, earnest, pale from indoor study, and possessed of the sort of tidy hair that announces a man trying to look reliable while thinking mostly about bridges. Holmes asks him what branch of engineering interests him. Henry says load-bearing structures. Holmes says dryly that hidden loads interest him as well. Watson has by now recognized that this means someone in the room should begin regretting choices. Holmes asks for the list of missing objects. He lays them in order and asks Mrs. Vale whether the breakfast card disappeared before or after she had written the amount owed to the butcher. After. Whether Henry ever assists in household accounts. Occasionally, if asked. Whether the servants know the sums. Not all of them. Holmes then asks, with deceptive casualness, whether Henry has debts. Mrs. Vale stiffens. Henry flushes. There are, it seems, some club dues and a tailor's account. Holmes is not impressed. Young men and tailors are old allies. He requests permission to return Thursday morning and observe breakfast without explanation to the servants. This is granted. On Thursday, Holmes and Watson hide, rather absurdly but effectively, behind the partly open communicating door from the morning room to a small study. From there, they watch breakfast through the crack. Mrs. Vale enters first, then Henry, then a maid bringing coffee, eggs, toast, marmalade, and the account card. Conversation is brief. Henry appears distracted. Mrs. Vale adds figures in a household book. A slight noise comes from outside the window. Henry glances toward it. The canary flutters. Mrs. Vale looks down again at the account card, then turns to refill coffee. In that instant, Henry, swift but practiced, slips the card beneath the tray cloth. Holmes opens the door at once. Henry freezes. It is not, as Watson had perhaps hoped, a thrilling confrontation. It is worse. It is embarrassing. Holmes retrieves the card, then explains in a tone so mild it becomes devastating that the earlier stolen objects were not thefts for value, but removals for concealment. The nephew, embarrassed by mounting small debts, had been quietly intercepting written account notes before his aunt could compare them fully with the household book, then later offering to help settle or copy figures where convenient. The spoon, knife, and other items vanished only when wrapped together with scrap notes he wished to pocket unnoticed. On other days there were no loose written tallies, so nothing was taken. The bird near the window, gifted by Henry, had been placed there partly because its occasional fluttering distracted his aunt during account checking. The noise at the window had been caused by Henry himself on previous Thursdays by lightly tapping the frame under pretense of shifting in his seat, training attention away from the table at just the needed moment. The case is not criminal in the grand sense. It is domestic, foolish, and painfully human. Henry confesses at once. He borrowed against expectations, feared exposure, and tried to postpone the inevitable until examinations were over. Mrs. Vale, who has the exhausted expression of a woman discovering that even engineering students can be idiots, sends the servants away and deals with the matter privately. De Holmes later tells Watson that modest deceptions often require more repetitive labor than honest misery. Had the boy confessed 6 weeks ago, he says, he would have suffered for one afternoon. By lying, he arranged to suffer every Thursday. It is difficult to improve on this as a general summary of many lives. So the cases go on. Some are curious, some pathetic, some comic, and most combine all three in Victorian proportions. There is the gentleman who feared a rival was entering his study by night, only for Holmes to prove that the true intruder was the gentleman's own habit of sleepwalking to the decanter and misplacing his dispatches on the pianoforte. There is the governess convinced that coded messages are being left in the conservatory until Holmes identifies them as plant delivery tallies reused by the gardener, whose arithmetic resembles a foreign conspiracy only because his spelling resembles a fever. There is a retired naval man certain he is being watched by a one-legged stranger outside his gate, and he is, although the stranger turns out to be the neighborhood cobbler, waiting discreetly to ask for overdue payment on orthopedic boots. Holmes accepts each puzzle on its merits. He is equally willing to expose blackmail, explain canaries, or save a person from dying of sheer social awkwardness. This flexibility is one reason the Holmes stories endure. They are not only detective tales, they are catalogues of anxiety. Victorian people, like modern people, worried about status, debt, secrets, appearance, inheritance, marriage, servants, employers, letters, neighbors, and whether anyone had noticed what they hoped no one had noticed. Holmes enters that nervous world not merely as a genius, but as a reader of the unofficial text of everyday life, the smudge on the envelope, the mud on the hem, the wrong kind of cigar ash, the absurdity of a lie told by someone who has not considered the timetable from Paddington. He gives the impression that reality is legible if only one is sufficiently annoying about it. One rainy evening, after a day in which no client has appeared, and Holmes has become so understimulated that he begins classifying cigarette ash with actual enthusiasm, Mrs. Hudson announces a visitor from the country. The man introduced is Dr. Silas Marrow, a village physician from Surrey, broad-shouldered, sun-browned, and wearing the expression of one forced by repeated bafflement to seek metropolitan assistance against his better judgment. He has not come about murder, though he admits that phrasing the matter any other way to his local neighbors would disappoint them. Instead, he reports a series of peculiar disturbances at a small manor house called Withercombe Grange. The owner, Miss Adeline Vane, lives there with a reduced household and an elderly aunt. Over the last month, a pattern has emerged. On 3 separate nights, at intervals of several days, someone has entered the old library after midnight and done nothing more than move a particular armchair several inches closer to the hearth, open the curtains a hand's breadth, and leave a single burnt match on the mantel. Nothing is stolen. Doors are found locked, windows fastened. Servants swear innocence. The aunt suspects ghosts, which Holmes considers a diagnosis with poor evidentiary discipline. Miss Vane suspects a former servant dismissed 2 years earlier. Dr. Marrow suspects family nerves inflamed by isolation, old architecture, and too many stories told in dim rooms. Yet, on the 3rd occasion, muddy traces were found near the side door, and the armchair, which is heavy, had undeniably been moved by someone with purpose. Holmes's interest awakens at once, because this is exactly the kind of matter he enjoys. Repetitive behavior without apparent gain. Criminals who take jewels are understandable. People who enter rooms to reposition furniture are either mad, symbolic, or both, and both are much better company. He asks questions rapidly. Is the library used daily? Less often now. Who normally sits in the chair? Miss Vane's aunt in the evenings. What view opens when the curtain is parted? The drive and front gate, all faintly visible by moonlight. What stands above the mantel? A portrait of the late Mr. Vane, Adeline's father. Why the match? No one knows. Is there a clock in the room? Yes, but it stopped months ago and has not been wound. Holmes asks for dates, weather, moonlight, servant arrangements, the aunt's hearing, the side door key, and the precise distance by which the chair was moved. Watson, who is used to this cascade, silently marvels while pretending not to. Dr. Merrow provides what he can. The disturbances occurred only on nights when Miss Vane's aunt had retired early with headaches. The library fire had been laid each time, but burned low. The curtain opened always on the left side. The chair moved perhaps 8 or 10 inches, enough to alter the sight line toward the drive. In the match had been burnt, but not used to light candle or lamp that anyone could identify. Holmes stands, paces once, and says they will go to Surrey in the morning. And that, I think, is where we shall pause for tonight's first half, with the lamps of Baker Street dim behind us, the countryside ahead under a pale and inconvenient moon, and Sherlock Holmes at last mildly entertained by a mystery involving a chair, a curtain, a dead man's portrait, and a burnt match that means either very little or exactly enough. The train carried them out through the smoky outskirts and into that quieter England where hedges replace shouting and every station platform looks as if it has been waiting politely for the empire to end. Holmes spent most of the journey with his eyes closed and his fingers together, which to strangers suggested repose, and to Watson suggested that some poor fact, somewhere, was being quietly hunted to extinction. Dr. Merrow, after 1 or 2 attempts at conversation, surrendered to the atmosphere and watched the landscape slide past in damp shades of green and brown. The farther they went from London, the more the mystery seemed to shrink from melodrama into something older, softer, and perhaps more troublesome. City crimes are noisy because cities are noisy. Country secrets can afford patience. By the time they reached the lane leading to Withycombe Grange, afternoon light was already thinning into that gray-gold tone which makes old houses appear either dignified or guilty, depending on who is looking. The Grange stood back from the road behind bare trees and an iron gate with too much ivy for good maintenance and too little for romance. It was a long, low, respectable house, built in parts over time. The original center, in weathered stone, later wings in brick, and one narrow side passage that seemed to have been added by a man who distrusted symmetry but loved inconvenience. The windows were tall in the older rooms, narrower where taste had shifted, and the chimneys rose in patient clusters against a pale sky. Nothing about the place announced terror. It announced receipts, inherited furniture, old opinions, and perhaps the occasional damp patch. Holmes was pleased at once. A house of gradual bad decisions, he murmured. They are the most informative. Miss Adeline Vane received them in a drawing-room whose restraint had just enough frayed edges to prove the household lived within means rather than merely discussing them. She was perhaps 30, composed, intelligent, and carrying herself with the particular steadiness of a woman who has long practiced not alarming older relatives and servants at the same time. Her aunt, Miss Euphemia Crowthorne, was introduced a little later, white-haired, sharp-eyed, wrapped in shawls, not nearly so feeble as her headaches apparently wished others to believe, and possessed of the kind of voice that had probably corrected family errors for 50 years without once rising above civility. Holmes liked them both immediately, though in different ways. Miss Vane was practical. Miss Crowthorne was dangerous in conversation. Now, between them, the household had probably survived several financial winters and at least one bishop. Over tea, the matter of the library was laid out more fully. On 3 nights, all within the last month, the room had been found disturbed in the same limited pattern. The chair by the hearth, one much used by Miss Crowthorne in the evening, stood several inches nearer the fire and slightly angled toward the left curtain. The curtain was parted just enough to give a view down the drive to the gate. A spent match lay on the mantel beneath the portrait of the late Mr. Vane. Nothing else was touched. There were no signs of forced entry. The servants had all been questioned, and the result, as is traditional in country houses, was not truth, but layers of injured dignity. Holmes asked whether the late Mr. Vane had habitually used the library. He had. Whether the aunt had always sat in that chair? Since his death, yes. Whether the portrait above the mantel was a good likeness? Miss Crowthorne said it was too flattering, which is the surest form of family identification. Whether anyone was expected or overdue on the nights in question. Miss Vane hesitated at this, and Holmes noticed the hesitation with the hungry calm of a cat hearing a cupboard door. There had been, she admitted, some uncertainty over letters from a cousin abroad and one regarding business with a solicitor in Guilford, but nothing that seemed connected. Holmes only bowed. He did not pounce. He preferred sometimes to let information imagine itself unnoticed, because people would then help it breed. He asked instead to see the library before nightfall. The room was large without being grand, lined on 3 walls with books and dark cases that had the dry, leathery smell of long use and occasional dusting by someone who disapproved of the mind but respected shelving. The 4th wall held the hearth, the portrait above it, and the mantel where the burnt match had been left each time. 2 windows looked toward the front, though only the left one, when parted in a certain way, offered a clear angle to the drive and gate through the trees. The armchair in question was indeed heavy, upholstered in faded green, and positioned at present square to the fire. Holmes walked the room in silence. He examined the carpet around the chair, the legs of the chair itself, the hearth-rug, the grate, the curtain hem, the window latch, the mantel, the portrait frame, the stopped clock on the side table, the door to the hall, and a second, a less used door that led by a short passage to the old morning room. He stood a while beneath the portrait, then stepped back until his calves touched the front of the chair and looked toward the window. Then he moved the chair 8 inches forward, turned it slightly, and looked again. Watson noticed the change at once. From the new position, a person seated in the chair could see the glimmer of the gate more clearly. Holmes nodded, as if a thought had politely confirmed its appointment. "Who discovered the disturbances?" he asked. The first time, Miss Vane herself. The second, a maid opening the curtains. The third, Miss Crowthorne, who came down earlier than usual. "And on the nights themselves?" Holmes asked. "Did anyone hear movement?" No one did. Though the house was old, the wind oft and active, and servants remarkably willing to let unexplained sounds become architecture. Holmes next asked to see the side door where muddy traces had been found. It opened off a narrow corridor near the back, from which one might reach the library without crossing the main hall if one knew the house. The key hung customarily inside during the day and was turned at night. On the third occasion it had been found still bolted in the morning. Holmes examined the threshold, the bolt, the jamb, and the exterior step. The marks themselves were gone, but Dr. Merrow described them as small, not boots caked in field mud, but lighter impressions as from a person who had crossed the wet path briefly. Holmes then walked out to the drive and looked back at the house, then from the gate toward the left library window. The sightline was plain enough. A lamp inside and a parted curtain would make the chair visible from the gate if one knew exactly where to look. "Was your father," he asked Miss Vane quietly, "accustomed to await callers in that chair?" She seemed surprised. "Yes, in the evenings, particularly when someone was expected late. He liked to watch the gate." "And your aunt?" "My aunt sat there with him often." Miss Crowthorne, who had followed more briskly than anyone had invited, said, "My brother-in-law had the tiresome habit of believing that if one stared at a drive hard enough, a carriage would arrive sooner." Holmes bowed to the wisdom of this. Then, rather unexpectedly, he asked whether any member of the household smoked matches to the end and placed them on the mantel rather than in the grate. Everyone denied it. Miss Crowthorne added that only fools waste good housekeeping by leaving burnt matches where they can be seen. Holmes did not contradict her. That evening he arranged, with as little ceremony as possible, for the household to behave naturally. This is always a comical request, because the moment natural behavior is requested, everyone begins performing versions of themselves like amateur actors in a moral tragedy. Still, dinner was taken, lamps lit, servants withdrawn, and by 10:30 the house had sunk into that country silence, which is never true silence at all, but a steady accumulation of minor sounds, the settling of boards, the murmur of chimney draught, a clock somewhere taking itself very seriously, the faint, restless branches outside, and occasionally the small, accusatory click of cooling metal in a grate. Holmes and Watson concealed themselves in the unused morning room, the door to the short passage left ajar by the width of a coin. From there they could see into the library, the fire low, the chair in its usual place, the curtain drawn, the portrait watching with benevolent oil paint, and the mantel pale in lamplight. Time passed. Waiting, as ever, occupied much of detection and nearly all of Watson's knees. Around midnight, when even expectation starts to yawn, Holmes's hand touched Watson's sleeve once very lightly. There had come a sound, not from the corridor, but from within the library itself. A soft, irregular brush, then stillness, then the minute rasp of fabric against upholstery. Holmes leaned forward. The chair moved, not violently, not by any invisible force determined to improve decor, but with the cautious, incremental motion of something exerting pressure from behind. It came forward perhaps 2 inches, paused, then another inch. Watson stared. The curtain edge shifted a little. A brief scratch sounded near the hearth. Holmes was through the door before surprise had properly arranged itself. Watson followed into the library to find Holmes already at the back of the chair, reaching down with one long arm. From between the chair and the wall there burst not a spectral intruder, not a desperate former servant, and not even a country-house lunatic of decent quality, but a thin, brindled spaniel with one white ear, a length of frayed tape tangled in its collar, and the expression of an animal caught in some private but deeply committed household project. The dog froze. Holmes did not. He lifted it clear, tied to the collar. By means of the frayed tape was a half-burnt matchstick. Watson after a moment in which all the knight's dignity collapsed inward, began to laugh in the painful, helpless way of a man whose imagination has traveled several expensive miles for no practical return. Holmes, however, did not laugh at first. He looked at the animal, at the tape, then at the curtain hem, where a few threads had snagged, and finally toward the passage. "Miss Crowthorne," he said into the doorway, "you may come in. Your accomplice has been detained." The old lady emerged from the shadows with less shame than annoyance at being anticipated. She took one look at the dog in Holmes's arms and said, "Jasper, you traitor," in the tone of betrayed command long familiar to both nephews and pets. Miss Vane, roused by the laughter and footsteps, just came in moments later, wrapped in a dressing gown, and there, before the dying library fire, the mystery resolved itself in a manner more touching than sensational, which is exactly how sleepy mysteries prefer to end. Miss Crowthorne had trained the dog over many evenings to tug the chair forward by the tape when released from the passage, to nose the left curtain apart where a morsel was tucked into the fold, and to jump lightly at the mantel where the match was tied as part of the sequence and dropped when he received a second bit of food placed there. It was, Holmes observed, an elaborate program for a spaniel and a deeply uneconomical program for a woman of advanced years. Why had she done it? At first, Miss Crowthorne refused to answer, declaring only that no crime had been intended, and the dog had behaved with more reliability than most clergy. But under Miss Vane's grave astonishment and Holmes's patient silence, the truth came out. The disturbances had begun after a letter arrived from Captain Julian Fane, Adeline's cousin, long believed settled abroad, and now returning to England after years away. Miss Crowthorne had concealed from her niece the fact that the cousin's father and the late Mr. Vane had once quarreled bitterly over a business guarantee, and that before his death Mr. Vane had regretted the estrangement deeply without ever composing a proper reconciliation. Miss Crowthorne feared the return of Julian would reopen bitterness, perhaps claims, perhaps grief, perhaps merely old family talk, which in some houses is worse than litigation. Yet she also knew that Adeline, practical creature that she was, had become so attached to order, duty, and the management of the house that she scarcely looked outward any more. The aunt had wanted, absurdly and tenderly, to recreate the old evening scene in which the family waited for an expected carriage at the gate. By moving the chair, parting the curtain, and leaving the burnt match beneath the portrait, she meant to suggest the late Mr. Vane's habit of watching the drive. She hoped, not very logically but with feeling, that Adeline would begin to speak of the past, of her father, of the cousin's impending return, and of whether the quarrel should be allowed to die at last. "I could not simply say it," Miss Crowthorne admitted. "Your father always managed serious matters by pretending to discuss something else. I may have inherited the defect." Adeline, who had listened with first disbelief, and then that sad affection reserved for intelligent relatives doing foolish things out of love, sat down in the very armchair and covered her aunt's hand. "You might have told me," she said. "I might have," said Miss Crowthorne, "but that has never been our family's strongest recreational activity." Holmes gently released Jasper, who immediately attempted to hide behind the chair in a way that entirely disproved his usefulness as a criminal instrument. The matter might have ended there in sentiment and embarrassment, had Holmes not added one more observation. The muddy traces by the side door on the third occasion were indeed human, not canine. Someone had come to the gate that night, but not entered the house. Captain Julian himself, Holmes suggested, they likely arrived later than expected, saw a light in the library, looked toward the familiar chair by the fire and the parted curtain, believed the household still wakeful, but changed his mind and turned back when no one came to the door. Dr. Merrill confirmed at once that the captain had in fact called at his surgery the following morning, having returned to the village unexpectedly the previous evening and taken lodgings nearby rather than disturb the Grange too late. The little domestic pantomime, then, had almost achieved what Miss Crowthorne intended. It had signaled welcome to precisely the right person, only by accident and with a dog. "A family drama," Watson said later, when they were again in their rooms, "with a spaniel as stage machinery." "My dear Watson," said Holmes, "the British family has always relied upon awkward intermediaries." The next day, Captain Julian came openly to the house. The old quarrel was discussed with much less disaster than the aunt had feared. Letters were produced, figures explained, regret distributed evenly among the dead, and Jasper received more attention than his moral status deserved. Holmes declined all thanks beyond necessity. The case had entertained him, which for Holmes was equivalent to a holiday. On the drive back to the station, Watson asked whether he had suspected the dog from the first. Holmes said no. At first, he had suspected a human agent reenacting a remembered signal. The slight incremental motion of the chair during the vigil altered that view. No person dragging it in the dark would pause in such tiny jerks unless working by leash or line. The frayed tape fibers on the chair back confirmed an attached agent of low altitude. The absence of any other disturbance in the room suggested an animal trained to repeat a route. The burnt match, so consistently displayed, could not have been accidental. It was a drop point in the dog's sequence, likely because it was light enough to tie and visible enough to satisfy the operator's theatrical instincts. "Miss Crowthorne," said Watson, "has theatrical instincts?" "All families do," said Holmes. "They merely differ in budget." Back in Baker Street, the London fog received them like an old debt. Cases resumed their usual mixture of vanity, confusion, and household failure. A gentleman misplaced a sealed packet and accused his nephew, only for Holmes to discover that the packet had slipped behind a bureau during an over-ambitious display of moral indignation the week before. A lady insisted that someone was entering her dressing room to steal single hairpins in a pattern of private malice. The culprit proved to be her own maid, who borrowed them to repair a canary cage and returned them irregularly with the desperate optimism common to servants managing problems created by both birds and employers. A bank clerk swore a conspiracy existed because 3 umbrellas had vanished from the stand in his office over 2 months. Holmes established that the stand was placed directly beside a hat rack, at the hour when visiting clients departed in rain, which transformed absent-mindedness into what the clerk preferred to call organized theft. Through each puzzle ran the same thin silver thread. People notice either too little or too much. Holmes's genius lay not only in noticing enough, but in noticing the correct amount. It sounds simple. It is not. Most of us are either blind to what matters or hypnotized by what does not. We stare at a dramatic footprint and miss the ash on the sill, or we fixate on the ash and fail to ask why the window was open in February. Holmes keeps proportion. He does not ask merely what is strange. He asks what is strange in a useful way. This made him formidable in fiction and would have made him exhausting at dinner. One late afternoon, as winter thickened over London and the fire at Baker Street did more serious labor, Watson sat with his friend after a modest supper and ventured a question he had likely asked before in one form or another. "What," he said, "first taught you that the smallest details may govern the whole?" Holmes, who had been leaning over a monograph on medieval ciphers that no client had requested and no normal person had wanted, laid it aside. "Need," he answered. "Need taught me. I found early that the world distributes its explanations parsimoniously. It rarely presents us with full confessions. It gives us fragments and expects us to deserve the rest." Watson, who was capable of genuine philosophical thought whenever Holmes forgot to hurry him, asked whether that was why Holmes preferred cases ignored by the police. "Partly," said Holmes, "and partly because large institutions are offended by what they have not already noticed. A thing becomes easier to deny in proportion to the rank of the person denying it." He looked into the fire. "Also, Watson, the small case is often the purest. Strip away the newspaper excitement, the legal machinery, the crowd of interested fools, and one may see motive in its natural state. Fear of embarrassment, fear of poverty, fear of being forgotten, fear of being known. There are only so many engines in the human machine." Watson observed that affection seemed sometimes to belong there as well. Holmes made a slight face at the sentiment, then admitted, "Yes, that too, though it does untidy the gears." It is easy, after so many retellings, to reduce Sherlock Holmes to an engine himself, a wonderful calculating instrument in a dressing gown. Yet the sleepy mysteries show something quieter. Holmes is interested in human beings not because he approves of them, and certainly not because he finds them efficient, but because they are forever leaking meaning in ridiculous ways. The bent candle, the unpaid bill, the garden soil on a hymn, the letter written in a hand pretending to be clumsier than it is, the chair moved toward a window so a dog may imitate memory. These things would be intolerable if they were not also touching. Perhaps that is why people still drift so easily into Baker Street. We like the promise that the confusion around us is readable. We like Watson's astonishment because it resembles our own. We like Holmes because he stands at the center of ordinary muddle and says, in effect, not that the world is simple, but that it is legible if one will be patient and a little less vain. The next case that concerns us tonight was one Holmes later referred to, with private amusement, as the adventure of the melancholy envelope, though Watson never published it under that name because he understood, better than Holmes did, that the public likes its mysteries with a slightly more muscular title. It began with a letter delivered by hand at 7 in the evening by a commissionaire wearing the badge of a gentleman's club off Pall Mall. The sender, Mr. Bernard Wythe, requested immediate consultation on a matter involving a repeated and impossible exchange of correspondence. The phrase interested Holmes enough that he abandoned the remains of his tea before entirely insulting it. Mr. Wythe arrived an hour later, tall, narrow, and carrying the severe expression of a man whose habits have been reliable for so long that disruption feels indecent. He belonged, it turned out, to that large Victorian class of gentlemen who were neither especially rich nor especially poor, but took inordinate moral shelter from regularity. He dined at his club thrice weekly, read history, disapproved of adjectives in public speaking, and lived alone in chambers with a valet who had served him long enough to become an atmospheric condition. His problem was this. For the last month, every Monday morning, a sealed envelope left on his writing desk Sunday night was found Monday instead in the top drawer beneath a volume of Livy, while in its place upon the desk appeared another envelope of the same size containing a blank sheet. Nothing had been stolen. The original letters, usually memoranda or invitations awaiting dispatch, remained unopened in the drawer. The blank substitute was always folded once, inserted, and sealed neatly. Desk locked? Yes. Valet trustworthy? Entirely. Visitors? None after Sunday dinner? Windows? Fastened. Mr. Wythe had first suspected forgetfulness, then the valet, then a tasteless practical joke mounted by one of two club acquaintances too old to know better and too idle not to try. Holmes asked to see one of the blank envelopes. It was of good stationery, faintly scented with lavender water, sealed with ordinary gum, and addressed in no hand at all because blank. Holmes asked whether Mr. Wythe kept his own envelopes in the desk. Yes. Whether they were this exact quality? No. Better quality, in fact. Holmes asked one more question. Had Mr. Wythe any female relation with access to his rooms in the building? The gentleman stiffened. His widowed sister occupied the flat below on a temporary basis while her house in Kensington was under repair. Holmes nodded with the serene look of a man hearing a lock turn somewhere inside a much larger mechanism. Then, he said, the case has every chance of becoming human. They visited the chambers next day. Mr. Wythe's rooms were admirable in the way dried specimens are admirable, carefully arranged, instructive, and not eager to entertain. The writing desk stood near the window. Above it hung maps and a framed print of the Roman Forum. The top drawer contained stationery, sealing wax, and the volume of Livy, beneath which the missing envelope was always found. Holmes inspected the desk, the lock, the hinges, the carpet around the table, the fender, the coal box, the fire irons, and the very dust upon the shelf. And then he asked to see the rooms below, occupied by the sister, Mrs. Clara Fenwick. She received them with frank irritation, which in Holmes's experience often indicated innocence, guilt, or adulthood. She was lively where her brother was rigid, conversational where he was exact, and plainly of the opinion that men who live by timetables deserve occasional moral discomfort. Her daughter, Miss Edith Fenwick, about 19, sat sewing by the window, with that quiet concentration which in young persons can mean modesty, intelligence, or the wish to disappear from elders discussing family nonsense. Holmes was courteous to all three, but Watson noticed a change in his attention when Edith rose to fetch tea. On the back of her left wrist there was a faint smudge of reddish-brown, quickly rubbed away when she saw him see it. "Oh, sealing wax," Holmes said later, once they had returned upstairs. "Not gum." Watson objected that the blank envelopes had been sealed with gum, not wax. "Precisely," said Holmes, "which means Miss Fenwick uses wax for her own letters, and was recently at work with correspondence. We must ask not who could open the desk, but who needs Mr. Wythe's Sunday letters removed from sight before Monday." The solution, once Holmes tugged at the proper thread, was exquisite in its smallness. Edith Fenwick had become unofficially engaged in that floating, half-spoken way common to young people with too little money and too much feeling, to a young curate whose prospects were decent but not yet presentable to the family. All she and the curate corresponded through the help of her aunt's maid, because her mother considered clergymen charming only at other people's tables. Mr. Wythe, severe guardian of standards and dispatch schedules, occasionally left on his desk Sunday night notes or invitations intended for Monday posting. Several of these, Edith learned, were addressed to acquaintances likely to visit or speak with her brother's former schoolmaster, who was also uncle to the curate and unfriendly to the match. Fearing discovery by means too absurdly indirect to sound credible even while happening, she borrowed a pass-key long kept among household odds below, opened her uncle's desk when he was out addressing, removed the letters only long enough to learn the names involved, then replaced the originals in the drawer under Livy, while leaving a blank sealed envelope on top, so that if her uncle noticed anything at a glance, the surface appearance of order would remain. By morning, if danger was absent, she quietly restored the true letter to its intended place before breakfast. Twice she had failed, hence the repeated impossible exchange. Why not simply ask her mother? Because mothers ask questions. Why not tell the curate to wait? Because curates in waiting are old enemies. Why the lavender scent? Because the substitute envelopes were borrowed from her mother's writing case downstairs. Holmes confronted no one publicly. Instead, he arranged to meet Mrs. Fenwick alone, explained enough to spare the girl disgrace, and suggested that if a clergyman of good conduct were to be invited more openly into their circle, the necessity of amateur espionage might diminish. Mrs. Fenwick, after the first shock, laughed so hard she had to sit down, then admitted she had suspected some romance, but not one involving classical historians and desk substitution. Mr. Wythe was informed only that the mystery had been domestic, uncriminal, and now ended. He accepted this with the restrained resentment of a man who would have preferred conspiracy to sentiment, because conspiracy at least respects procedure. Why conceal the truth from him? Watson asked afterward. Because, said Holmes, the young have a right to one or two secret absurdities before their elders correct them into respectability. It was a surprisingly generous opinion, and Watson treasured it, because Holmes offered such things rarely and always, as if smuggling them past his own intellect. Winter deepened. Holmes had cases enough, though not all are ours to follow tonight. There was one involving an apothecary's ledger and a bishop's cook, which ended in matrimony. Another involving a violin teacher, 3 identical overshoes, and an insurance clerk, with handwriting so self-important that Holmes solved half the matter by simply disliking the loops in his capitals. Yet what lingers when the noise of events settles are not the legal outcomes or the newspaper summaries. It is the rooms, the wet lamps in the street, the tucked-away anxieties of ordinary people, the feeling that beneath London's soot and manners everyone was conducting some private campaign against embarrassment, loneliness, debt, memory, or expectation. Holmes moved through those campaigns like a man reading marginal notes no one else realized they had written. Sometimes he saved fortunes. Sometimes he saved reputations. Sometimes he saved only a little peace in a boarding house or an old family's ability to speak honestly over tea. It was enough. One night, very late, when no client remained and the city had sunk to the distant hush that only great cities know after midnight, Watson woke in his bedroom at Baker Street to the thin, hesitant line of Holmes's violin. It was not the fierce playing he sometimes used to think through facts, nor the dreamy improvisation of boredom. This was quieter, almost careful. Watson, accustomed to the domestic oddities of genius, lay still and listened. In the morning he found Holmes at the window with coffee gone cold beside him, and staring out into a pale dawn over the roofs. "You were awake early," Watson said. "I had been thinking of Withercombe," said Holmes. "Of the dog." "Of the ant," said Holmes, "and of the extent to which people labor to avoid saying one plain thing." Watson, who had both medical training and experience of dinner conversation, said that this seemed a very large subject to address before breakfast. "It is the substance of half my cases," Holmes replied. "A letter not sent, a bill not admitted, a son not forgiven, a proposal not spoken, a grief dressed up as furniture. If the world would confess itself more readily, I should be out of work," Watson said, "and considerably less famous." Holmes gave him one sidelong glance. Fame is what arrives when one solves enough other people's hesitation. There is something almost sleepy in that thought. We imagine mysteries as storms, but often they are fog, hesitation made weather. And no one moved through fog more elegantly than Sherlock Holmes. He did not always hurry. He did not always explain at once. He stood, observed, waited, and let the small truths emerge from corners where everyone else had politely agreed not to look. That is why the stories still soothe, even when they begin in distress. The world inside them is uncertain, yes, but not unreadable. The footprints will mean something. The ash will sort itself. The envelope, the curtain, the dog, the chair, the misplaced account card, the biscuit, the duplicate key, the blank substitute letter, all of it will finally settle into shape beneath the patient attention of a man too curious to sleep and a doctor kind enough to write it down. And perhaps that is the final comfort of Baker Street. Not that evil is always dramatic and punished, though sometimes it is. Not even that Holmes is always right, though infuriatingly often he is. It is that confusion need not remain confusion forever. Somewhere, in some lamp-lit room smelling faintly of tobacco, books, and chemical experiments that would alarm a landlord, a mind is at work upon the untidy evidence of human life with dry patience and unreasonable confidence. Outside, London rolls on in smoke and hoofbeats. Inside, the fire burns lower. Watson turns another page. Holmes lifts his eyes from a cuff, a footprint, a line of ink, or a badly told lie. The mystery, however small, has finally found the worst possible enemy, someone who notices.